There is a sentence Diana spoke into a private camera in 1992 that almost nobody paid attention to at the time. She was not speaking about Camilla. She was not speaking about Catherine, who was then a 10-year-old girl growing up in Berkshire with no connection to the royal family whatsoever. She was speaking about herself, about what had been done to her, and she described it with a precision that should have made everyone in that building deeply uncomfortable. The sentence was this: there is no better way to dismantle a personality than to isolate it. 3 decades later, the woman Diana had been speaking about used that exact method on someone else, and the woman who finally stopped it was the last person anyone expected, for reasons that cut far deeper than anything that made the front page. If you want to follow this story as it keeps unfolding, hit that subscribe button now. The details that matter most in a story like this are almost never the ones the headlines choose to carry. But to understand why what happened in that corridor was so much more than a photograph, you have to go back. Not to the corridor, not to the ceremony, back to a woman sitting alone in a room at Kensington Palace answering questions into a camera she believed would stay private forever. The photograph ran on the front page of every major British newspaper the following morning. It was taken in a corridor on the first floor of Buckingham Palace, and it showed 3 women caught in a single frame at the exact moment the frame told a story none of them had agreed to tell publicly. In the foreground, Princess Anne was walking forward. Her posture was absolutely straight. Her expression was giving nothing away at all, in the specific and practiced way of someone who has spent 5 decades learning that a face in the right moment is its own kind of authority. Beside her, 1 step back and slightly to her left, was Catherine, Princess of Wales, and beneath the archway at the far end of the corridor, standing completely motionless and entirely alone, was Queen Camilla. There was no argument visible in the image, no raised voices, no documents being waved, no staff members positioned at anxious intervals. Just 3 women, a corridor, a closed door that 2 of them had walked through, and the silence of a morning that had already said everything it needed to say. By the time the morning news programs began, the country had already decided what the photograph meant. A national broadcaster opened its evening bulletin the night before with the line that became the verdict: the Princess Royal has drawn a line inside the House of Windsor. Within hours, the image had been reproduced in dozens of languages across dozens of countries. Outside the palace gates, a small crowd gathered in the kind of quiet, purposeful way that distinguishes genuine feeling from performance. 1 handmade sign rose above the rest, 3 words on it: strength without revenge. The public read the photograph as a confrontation, a power shift, a moment when someone finally said enough and meant it without flinching. Almost all of them were right about the outcome. Almost all of them were wrong about at least one thing that mattered beneath it. What they saw was Anne walking forward with Catherine beside her. What they did not see was the 6 months of handwritten documentation that had made that walk necessary, the journal filled with dates and initials that Anne had kept in a leather notebook, the original placement card that Catherine had quietly folded in half inside Westminster Abbey and carried in her handbag for weeks without ever using it as a weapon, or the final page of a crimson folder that had frightened Camilla far more than the corridor itself. And what almost nobody reported was the detail that changes the shape of everything. The woman standing motionless under that archway had already read the folder. She had already seen the final page. She had come to that corridor anyway, not because she believed she could reverse the outcome, but because she needed to look Anne in the eye one last time before it was over and understand what kind of act this actually was. That is not the behavior of a woman who simply lost a fight. That is the behavior of a woman who finally understood what the fight had truly been about. And understanding that requires going back much further than the corridor. It requires going back to another woman in another decade, in a building that no longer exists, and to 1 sentence she spoke that nobody thought to hold on to as a warning until it was too late to matter. There is no better way to dismantle a personality than to isolate it. Diana said that in 1992 it would take 30 years, 1 altered placement card, and a leather notebook filled with careful handwriting before anyone in that family acted on it. To understand why Anne was the woman who finally did, you have to understand something about Anne and Diana that almost every account of this story quietly leaves out. Princess Anne and Princess Diana were not close. That detail matters enormously, and it is almost always absent from the story people tell about that corridor. They shared a family, a surname, and decades of ceremonial obligations that placed them in the same rooms at regular intervals throughout their adult lives. They denied having a feud whenever the press asked them directly, and both did so with the particular fluency of people trained since childhood to say precisely what the occasion requires and nothing beyond it. Diana told a reporter in 1985 that Anne was her biggest fan. Anne described allegations of tension between them as fairy stories. Neither statement was dishonest. Neither statement captured what was actually happening in the rooms where the cameras were not pointed. The friction between them was real, documented among household staff and visible to anyone who paid attention at family gatherings across 2 decades. Diana was intimidated by Anne by the way Anne carried her authority, by the sheer volume of her discipline, by a kind of self-possession that Diana had spent her entire royal life trying to locate in herself and never quite finding in the same form. Anne, for her part, watched her younger sister-in-law's effortless emotional connection with the public and felt, according to those who worked closely with her, that it cast everything she did in a different light. She had been the working royal for years before Diana arrived. She had built that position through endurance, through the kind of service that does not photograph well because it involves cold weather and unglamorous organizations and no real interest in whether anyone notices. And then Diana arrived and the cameras never looked away again. Anne had expected to be godmother to Prince William. She was not chosen. Charles assured her there would be another opportunity. She was not chosen for Harry either. A close friend of Diana's was chosen instead, and Anne's reaction behind closed doors was by all accounts not gracious. They were never enemies. They were something more complicated and harder to name, 2 women in the same institution who had arrived at entirely different conclusions about what service meant, what duty required, and what the crown was ultimately for. In 1992, Diana sat down in front of Peter Sutherland's camera at Kensington Palace and began recording private sessions that would not be broadcast publicly until 25 years after her death. Anne was not in that room. Anne would not encounter the recordings for years. But in one of those sessions, Diana described something that stops the air when you hear it clearly. She was describing what had been done to her, the mechanism, the quiet, patient procedural process by which a person inside an institution can be made to feel smaller without anyone ever formally reducing them. Remove the briefings, adjust the placements, ensure that the information she needs moves through other hands before it reaches her. Do it through paperwork and protocol so that any complaint she makes sounds paranoid. Do it quietly and repeatedly over months until the target begins to doubt whether she is imagining it. And then when she finally speaks, make sure that what she says sounds like instability rather than evidence. There is no better way to dismantle a personality than to isolate it. Diana named it while it was being done to her. She named it from the inside with the involuntary clarity of someone who had worked out the mechanism through pure experience rather than observation. She died in Paris in August of 1997. Anne, by multiple accounts, was shaken by the death in a way that surprised people who thought they understood the relationship. Not because they had been close, because Anne had watched the machine run on Diana for 16 years. She had stood in the same rooms, attended the same ceremonies, been present for the same institutional silences. She had watched from the other side of a room on dozens of occasions and understood somewhere beneath the level of formal acknowledgement exactly what she was watching. And she had not stopped it. The nature of that regret is specific and difficult to articulate. It is not grief for a friendship, it is the weight that settles on someone who recognized something for what it was in real time and chose the path of institutional quietness over the path of interference. Anne had been trained for that quietness her entire life. The institution rewarded it. She had given it over and over for decades. She did not give it again. The Commonwealth service takes place at Westminster Abbey on the second Monday of March each year. Flag bearers and high commissioners from 56 nations fill the nave. The photographers know their positions before they arrive. They know which frame will matter, which placement signals what, and which figure standing where will carry the message that the morning papers need without a single word of caption. Catherine had been assigned a specific role in the service rehearsal. She was to stand beside William during the procession and receive a sealed briefing from senior household officials afterward. Both assignments had been confirmed in writing, approved through the appropriate channels, and communicated to the relevant staff well in advance of the morning. 8 minutes before the rehearsal began, an aide walked down the center aisle of Westminster Abbey carrying a revised placement card. The instruction on it carried the written approval of Camilla's private office. The phrase used to justify the change was visual hierarchy, a legitimate term in royal ceremonial planning referring to the public ordering of figures in ways that communicate rank responsibility and the current distribution of the monarch's confidence. It is also, when deployed with a certain kind of creativity, a very efficient way to remove someone from a prominent position while appearing to simply be adjusting furniture. Catherine's briefing was quietly reassigned to another member of the family. Her position in the procession was moved several places back away from William, out of the frame that the photographers had already positioned themselves to capture. Catherine read the revised card. She took the original card, the one that carried her actual assigned position, the one confirmed in writing and approved at the appropriate level, and she folded it once precisely down the center. She placed it in her handbag. She kept her face completely still while the weight of the morning settled over her, and she did it in a room full of staff who were watching her face for exactly the reaction she refused to give them. Anne watched her do it. And the moment Anne watched Catherine fold that card was the moment something shifted. Not just in her reading of what Camilla's office had been doing, in her understanding of what her own silence had cost before and what it would cost again if she chose it now. She did not choose it. She went directly to the aide and asked without visible heat who had authorized the change. The answer came with a hesitation that told her everything the aide already understood: that a problem had been identified and was uncertain whether honesty or deflection served him better. The instruction had traveled through Camilla's office under the visual hierarchy justification. The king had approved no such alteration. Not verbally, not in writing, not through his private secretary. Charles had personally assigned Catherine that briefing. Someone inside his own household had overridden his instruction without informing him. That evening, Anne opened a leather notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first page. She wrote what she had observed. She wrote who had authorized the change and what language had been used to justify it. She noted the aide's hesitation. She used initials in certain places rather than full names. She wrote nothing in digital form. No email, no message, no record that a household IT review could ever surface without her knowledge. This was not the reaction of someone responding impulsively to a single incident. This was the behavior of someone who had already decided that what she was watching was a pattern rather than an error, and that a pattern of this kind would eventually require evidence, the kind of evidence that holds up when the person reviewing it is not inclined to find it convincing. She wrote in that notebook for 6 weeks. What she built during those 6 weeks was not a grievance, it was a timeline. And what the timeline showed across entry after careful entry was something that could no longer be described as a private family difficulty. The review that Anne eventually commissioned was conducted by 2 officials, neither of whom worked in any office connected to Camilla. It covered 6 months of internal schedules, message records, approval chains, and communication traffic that the palace does not release to anyone outside an extremely small circle. It took several weeks. When it was complete, the finding was not ambiguous. Briefings assigned to Catherine had been delayed, sometimes by days, without explanation that reached her office. Placement decisions at official ceremonies had been revised after initial approval, with the revisions carrying the language of routine administrative adjustment while traveling through channels that ensured they would not require the king's direct sign-off. Messages intended for Catherine's team had been read before they arrived. Meeting requests from Catherine's office to senior advisors had received a specific repeated response: the matter was under a review when no review existed anywhere in the system. A legal review had been cited in writing as the basis for delaying a scheduled briefing, and that legal review had been invented. No law officer had received any instruction. No file existed. The review had been created specifically to manufacture a justification for a delay on paper. All of it inside 6 months, all of it pointing at the same office. The documentation mattered because it transformed the nature of what Anne was dealing with. Adjustments born from insecurity are a family problem. A pattern of unauthorized interference with officially assigned duties conducted through fabricated procedural justifications recorded in writing over 6 months. That is a different category entirely. And Anne had something that made her position in the corridor that would follow formally unassailable in a way that had nothing to do with family hierarchy or personal authority. In November of 2022, King Charles had sent a formal message to both houses of Parliament on his own birthday requesting that the Regency Acts be amended to add Princess Anne and Prince Edward to the list of councillors of state, the small group of people legally authorized to act on behalf of the monarch when he is unable to perform his duties due to illness or absence. The bill moved through Parliament in 22 days. Under its provisions, Anne became a Councillor of State permanently for the remainder of her life. This was not a title, it was not ceremonial recognition, it was a constitutional designation legislated by Parliament, which meant that the authority she carried into that corridor when Charles signed the directive was not personal. It was legal. Standing in front of Anne at that moment was legally equivalent to standing in front of the king. 6 weeks before the corridor, Anne wrote one entry in her notebook that did not make full sense until later. It read, "C does not know what is in the folder. Neither does W yet. Charles has not decided." That entry contained a detail about Charles that would become the hinge of everything that followed. He had the folder. He had been reading it. He had not signed it. What finally moved him to sign it began with a visit from his son on a Thursday morning. William brought the note to Anne on a Thursday. It was a confidential internal document from Camilla's office requesting that Catherine's throne room briefing be postponed. The justification cited a private legal review that Charles had authorized, reasonable on its surface. Households produce documents like this routinely. Pending reviews are cited constantly as administrative grounds to hold decisions in place while other matters resolve. Except for one detail. It took William approximately 4 seconds to identify it. And once he had identified it, the note changed character entirely. Charles had authorized no such review. No law officer had received any instruction. No file existed anywhere in the relevant system. The legal review cited as the basis for delay had been invented, and it had been invented with sufficient specificity to pass through official channels without immediate challenge, which meant that the invention had not been casual. It had been deliberate. An interference conducted deliberately in writing in a document that would become part of the official record is a fundamentally different problem from interference conducted informally orally in the way that leaves no trace. William sat with the note for a long time before he moved. He had thought carefully about who he would take it to because that choice would determine everything that followed. His father would hear the concern. Charles had always been a man who received difficult information with visible gravity, and then in the silence after the room emptied found a way to believe that patience would produce a resolution that directness would only complicate. William had watched this his entire life. He understood it even. He understood the calculation his father had been running, understood the particular weight that Charles carried into any room where he was being asked to choose between two women he loved, understood the shadow that fell across every such room for reasons that had never really left the family. He went to Anne instead. He chose every word with care. He told her that Catherine had not sought Camilla's position, had never asked to be moved forward, had never once asked to be deployed as a symbol against anyone else in the family. His wife would carry whatever the institution required her to carry. She had always understood that, and she had never once complained about it. But there was a line that had been crossed when the denial of information moved from personal discomfort to fabricated documentation. You could not ask a person to protect something while systematically denying her the knowledge required to protect it. And then he said the thing that did not require any document to support it. He was 15 years old when he buttoned a dark suit and walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the entire planet watched him do it. He knew with the specific and permanent knowledge of someone who learned it at 15 on one of the most watched days in modern history exactly what the institution does when it has not prepared the people it expects to perform. It watches, it records, and it never once stops to ask whether anyone made them ready for what they were about to walk through. He was not going to let that happen to his wife, not for anyone's comfort, not for another 6 months of hoping a problem would dissolve if left alone in a quiet enough room. Anne looked at the notebook. She looked at the note William had brought. She looked at her nephew's face, at the particular quality of stillness in it, the kind of stillness that comes not from the absence of emotion, but from a decision made so far in advance of the conversation that the conversation itself is almost a formality. And then she went to find her brother. The conversation between Anne and Charles lasted less than 30 minutes. Its most consequential feature was what Charles did not say. Anne laid the documentation in front of him. the altered placement card from the Commonwealth rehearsal, the delayed briefings, the diverted messages, the note about the legal review that had never existed. She asked him one question, and she asked it quietly: how long was this going to continue, before someone in that building acknowledged what it was. Charles did not dispute a single item. He did not question the documentation, did not suggest the pattern might have an innocent explanation, did not offer the kind of thoughtful institutional reframing that might buy more time for a situation to improve on its own. He sat with the evidence, and he was silent. And the people who have worked near that man for years will tell you that his silence in rooms like that one carries two distinct weights simultaneously: anger at the situation and shame at himself, because the anger is for what has happened, and the shame is for the months in which he recognized the shape of it and chose to believe that gentleness would eventually produce what directness would only disturb. To understand Charles in that room, you have to understand the calculation he had been running for months, because it was not a simple calculation and it was not made in bad faith. The last time this family was required to choose publicly between two women, it ended with a coffin at Westminster Abbey and a nation that has never fully forgiven him. He has spent nearly 30 years managing that wound in himself and in the institution he now leads. So when something with the same general shape arrived again, smaller in scale, better people on every side of it, no cameras, he did what he has always done with choices that carry that particular gravity. He waited. He said careful things to everyone involved, and he hoped with the specific and quietly desperate hope of someone who has survived enough public pain that any private difficulty feels manageable by comparison, that the problem would find its own level before it required a decision. Camilla had told him the truth behind closed doors weeks earlier. Her position felt smaller every time Catherine walked into a room. No title had been altered. No formal role had changed. Nothing on paper looked different from the day before, but she could feel the future arriving in that building while she was nowhere near finished with the present. She had fought for acceptance beside Charles through a level of public contempt that would have broken almost anyone who had not chosen to endure it deliberately. She had waded through the documentaries, the polling, the years in which her name in any headline was guaranteed to carry a specific negative charge. And then when the acceptance finally came, when the crown was placed on her head, and she had what she had waited for, the thing she had not anticipated was this: that the future had been arriving all along, and that its arrival had nothing to do with her and nothing against her, and would proceed regardless of what she did about it. Charles heard the fear under her words. He recognized it. He also recognized the danger sitting inside it, and he did what people in his position have always done with choices they cannot bear to make cleanly. He offered her enough reassurance to feel supported while leaving enough ambiguity that he had technically made no concrete commitment. That ambiguity was the hinge. It let Camilla believe she had his support, while he told himself he had promised nothing specific. And in the gap between those two beliefs across 6 months, the decisions that filled Anne's notebook were made. Anne left the meeting with Charles without the answer she had come for. She wrote one final entry in her notebook that evening. It said he knows. He will not act until the folder is in front of him with a pen. She requested a private meeting with the king the following morning. She brought the notebook and everything in it. Charles read the Royal Continuity Directive 4 times before he signed it. The document had the dry, precise title of its function and nothing more decorative than that. Its purpose was straightforward: to define in writing who receives which sensitive briefings and carries which responsibilities in the event that the monarch becomes unable to perform his duties, so that when such a moment arrives, if it arrives, when it arrives, nobody spends the first hours of a genuine national emergency in a hallway somewhere debating authority. Catherine's inclusion in it did not make her sovereign. It did not move her one place in the succession, did not assign her any formal title, did not give her any power that could be exercised independently of the structures already in place. It prepared her for responsibilities she will one day carry beside William, and it ensured that preparation was grounded in real information rather than in whatever briefings happened to reach her office without interference. Charles read it the first time and did not sign it. He read it the second time and thought about Camilla reading it, about the particular way she held documents when they contained something she had been trying to prevent, the careful stillness that came over her face before she allowed herself to react. He read it the third time and thought about William's face in the meeting where his son had laid out the argument with such precise and restrained force, choosing every word as though he understood that the wrong one would close the room and the right ones might open it. He read it the fourth time and noticed something that nobody had drawn to his attention because nobody had expected him to be looking quite this carefully at the final page. The final page was not primarily about Catherine. It stated in the formal language of a Royal Administrative Directive that all unauthorized interference with the Princess of Wales's official duties, her ceremonial placements, her access to senior advisors, her schedule of briefings must cease immediately from the moment of the monarch's signature. Any future changes to any of these matters would require the monarch's written approval, not verbal confirmation, not a note carried down an administrative chain by an aide under a phrase like visual hierarchy. Written approval in the king's own hand in a record that would exist permanently. Charles sat with that page for a long time. What Anne had built was not a case against Camilla. It was a formal written definition of what Camilla was and was not permitted to do. From this point forward, and by signing it, he was not choosing Catherine over his wife. He was closing the route that Camilla had been using because that route left open would cost her everything the moment William's reign began, and the record from those 6 months was examined by people who had not been asked to be understanding about it. He was protecting her in the only way still available, which was the way she had not asked for and would not initially recognize as protection, but which was the only option that did not end in a far worse accounting. He picked up the pen. Before he set it down, he added one instruction the directive had not originally contained. He designated Anne as the person responsible for enforcing the briefing without further delay. Not advising, not attending as a family representative, enforcing. The word was specific and its implications were clear. Standing in front of Anne from this moment was legally and constitutionally equivalent to standing in front of the king. Camilla received her copy of the directive that afternoon. An aide placed it beside a cup of tea she never touched. She read it once, then read the final page again, then removed her glasses and sat very still for a time. She had spent her entire adult life learning to read situations before they announced themselves. She read this one in under a minute. She understood exactly what it meant, and she understood something else that the page itself did not say, but that she had enough experience to supply herself. Her husband had signed this not in anger and not to diminish her and not to replace her with a younger woman in any sense that the word replacement actually meant. He had signed it because he had finally run out of road. And in signing it, he had, in the particular oblique way that Charles manages most of the things that hurt, tried to protect her from herself. She set the directive down and made one more decision. She went to the corridor. This is the part of the story that almost every account has misread, because the assumption everyone brought to that corridor, the assumption that Camilla had gone there to fight, to make one final argument, to try through force of personality, what she could no longer accomplish through paperwork does not survive contact with what she actually knew before she walked in. She had read the directive. She had seen the final page. She understood that the king had signed it, that he had done so without warning her in advance, and that by designating Anne as the enforcer, he had ensured that no private conversation, no emotional appeal, and no last-minute request, through any channel she still had access to, could reverse what had been set in motion. She was not walking to that corridor because she believed she could stop the briefing. She had absorbed the loss of that possibility in the sitting room with the untouched tea. She went because she needed to understand one thing the document could not tell her. She needed to know whether what Anne had done had been institutional or personal, whether the case Anne had built was the response of someone who had watched a pattern of unauthorized interference and built a formal record because the monarchy required it, or whether it carried something colder inside it, the specific pleasure of correcting someone who had once occupied a position of disadvantage and was now overreaching. The distinction mattered to Camilla in a way that is difficult to explain unless you understand what she had survived to arrive at that morning. She found Anne and Catherine in the corridor. She asked for a delay. The word she chose was specific delay, not cancellation. She already knew the briefing would happen. She was asking for time. Anne told her the decision no longer belonged to her. Charles had signed the instruction himself. Camilla looked at the crimson folder in Anne's left hand and asked what was written on the final page. Anne did not answer. She stood completely still and said nothing. And in that silence, Camilla received the answer she had actually come to find. Because if this had been personal, if Anne had built the case out of something colder than institutional duty, the silence would have been different. Cruelty of a personal kind wants to be acknowledged. This silence was not that. It was the silence of someone who had found what the role required and had performed it as correctly as she could, without pleasure and without relish and without any particular interest in the emotional effect of her correctness on the woman standing in front of her. Camilla said one last thing before she stepped back. She said Anne might control the doorway, but the true decision rested inside the folder beneath the final page, under a signature that neither of them could argue with. She was right about that in more ways than she realized at the time. Anne turned away from her. She extended her hand toward Catherine, and she walked her through the doors of the throne room in front of 2 aides and 1 camera that nobody had accounted for in a corridor on the first floor of Buckingham Palace on an ordinary weekday morning in a month the press had already moved past. The photograph ran everywhere. The national broadcaster opened its evening bulletin with the line that became the caption the country chose. The Princess Royal has drawn a line inside the House of Windsor. By the following morning, the sign outside the gates had been photographed so many times it had become its own kind of emblem. Strength without revenge. The commentary poured in from every direction. Royal experts, former aides, historians of the monarchy, people who had covered this family for decades, and almost all of it agreed on the basic reading of events. Anne had acted. Catherine had been prepared. Camilla had been left standing under an arch. The reading was not wrong about the outcome. It was missing the most important decision that had been made in the days surrounding it. Because the most consequential act of that entire sequence was not Anne's. It was not Charles's signature. It was not William's Thursday morning arrival with the note that proved a legal review had been invented. The most consequential act was Catherine's, made privately before any of the public events unfolded, and made in a direction that almost nothing in the coverage thought to look. Catherine had specifically requested that no public announcement be made about the findings of the internal review. She had asked that Camilla's charitable patronages and public program be fully preserved, that her engagements continue, that the organizations dependent on her association with them remain undisturbed. She had asked that the consequences of the review focus entirely on duty and procedure, with no element structured as personal blame. No detail framed as public diminishment, no story shaped in a way that would produce the kind of front pages that write themselves for months when a powerful woman is being formally reduced. She had been handed, in effect, a clean shot. She had the documentation, she had the review findings, she had a story that would have run in every outlet in the country, with her as the wronged protagonist and Camilla as the documented antagonist, and it would have run for a very long time. She chose not to use it. Not from weakness, not from instruction, because she had married into a family that had already done this to one woman, and she had spent her entire marriage being measured against photographs of that woman, and she understood in a way that was both personal and institutional exactly what the machinery does to a woman once the decision has been made that she is being replaced. She had watched it documented and replayed and analyzed for the entirety of her adult life. She had decided she would not participate in doing it to someone else. The country read the photograph as Anne walking forward. The deeper story was Catherine choosing at the precise moment when restraint was most costly and most powerful not to run it. Then the official framework closed and 2 women still had to sit in a room together. No officials, no family members posted at the perimeter, no palace language to structure what was said. 1 room, 2 women, and everything that had happened between them for 6 months, sitting in the air between them like something heavy that neither had asked to be responsible for. Catherine arrived first. She set something on the table before Camilla came through the door. The placement card was roughly the size of a postcard. The original, the one Catherine had been handed at the Commonwealth Service rehearsal before the revised version arrived 8 minutes before the procession. It had been folded once precisely down the center. The crease was still visible, the specific crease that comes from a card being folded by someone who needed her hands to do something quiet while she absorbed something quietly devastating in a room full of people watching her face for the reaction she was not going to give them. Catherine had carried it in her handbag for weeks, through the review, through the documentation, through every moment when using it would have been easy, justifiable, and effective. She placed it on the table and told Camilla she had not kept it as evidence. She had kept it as a reminder, specifically as a reminder of the kind of future queen she never intended to become, the kind who protects her position by taking things from another woman inside a building where that woman has spent her entire adult life trying to belong. By the time she said this, Catherine had already received the throne room briefing. She understood the weight of what Charles had placed on her shoulders, the continuity planning, the decision she would be expected to carry beside William, the preparation for a reign that was still years away, but would arrive whether anyone was ready for it or not. She had also understood something that Camilla had missed during 6 months of trying to prevent that preparation. Power taken through another woman's shame does not survive the transfer. It poisons whatever it was meant to protect. She had watched this principle operate inside this family before in photographs and in silence, in the specific way that history repeats itself when nobody writes the lesson down clearly enough to be used. Camilla stood at the window for a long moment before she crossed the room to the table. She looked at the card. She did not reach for the administrative language that had served her for 6 months. She did not redirect to procedure or invoke household protocol or find a phrase that would allow her to occupy the position of someone who had been misunderstood. For the first time in this entire story, she stopped defending. She admitted she had authorized the change at the Abbey. She did not place the responsibility on an aide. She accepted that her fear had traveled so far past its own origin that it had become something she could no longer recognize as fear, that it had calcified into interference, and that the interference had been deliberate, and that she had known what it was when she was doing it and had continued anyway, because stopping felt like conceding something she was not ready to concede. She apologized without qualification, without condition, without the kind of partial acknowledgement that maintains some structural distance between the apology and the act that required it. Catherine answered her with the thing she had come to say, and it was not forgiveness because it was too early for that, and both of them understood it. It was a boundary stated without anger and without theater. Respect would remain, duty would continue, interference would not. And within those terms, everything Camilla had built over decades of genuine public service, the charitable work that was entirely hers, the organizations that bore her association and depended on it, none of it would be disturbed. Camilla accepted the terms, not only because she had limited options, because she had finally arrived after 6 months of going in the wrong direction at the understanding that had been available to her the entire time. She had been so afraid of the future arriving that she had been trying to slow it with tools that would destroy her own standing the moment it arrived regardless. And the record from those months was examined by people with no particular interest in being charitable about it. Catherine had not entered the throne room to replace her. She had entered it to be ready for a reign that was still years away. And in trying to prevent that readiness, Camilla had used the exact mechanism that Diana had named and carefully described in a private room at Kensington Palace 30 years earlier, used it against someone who had studied Diana's story long enough and carefully enough to recognize it, and had then been given the opportunity to use it back and refused. Diana had said it was the most effective way to dismantle a personality. What Diana had never found across 16 years of being inside that mechanism was the answer to it. Nobody had been in a position to give it to her. The institution had watched and recorded and not intervened. Catherine placed a folded placement card on a table in a private room and answered the sentence 30 years after it had been spoken into a camera in a building that no longer exists. Dignity cannot be protected by taking dignity away from someone else. Camilla sent the placement card back a week later. Her note with it called it the resentment she was ready to give up. The crimson folder went into the Royal Archives, where the Crown keeps the records it never intends to explain publicly. Charles is still king, his treatment reduced in the new year by his own account. A personal blessing is what he called it in a filmed message that ran in December. Anne returned to her engagements the morning after the corridor without comment to anyone who asked. William said nothing for the record. Catherine said nothing for the record. The palace confirmed only that an expanded continuity briefing for the Princess of Wales had taken place, and that all of the Queen Consort's charitable commitments remained fully intact. And somewhere in that building, in a leather notebook that only a very small number of people have ever seen, the last entry Anne wrote reads as follows: done. The folder is signed. Diana's sentence finally has an answer. It took 3 women and 1 card to find it.